Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining the webinar on how to turn your savings into a paycheck, a recurring, reliable paycheck. We're going to talk about a few different strategies, some pitfalls, some things you can do to avoid those pitfalls. It should be pretty interesting. It'll probably take maybe about 20 minutes. I have about 20 slides, some pretty good examples towards the end. And let's get started. I'm going to put my reading glasses on so I can get through this, and let's get on our way here. So, the retirement income challenge. What are some of the challenges that retirees face? Well, first of all, people are living longer, right? I mean, we have 30 years of income potentially. People are living longer, and a lot of people are retiring earlier. So you have a long time to cover, a long time span to cover. Inflation erodes the purchasing power over time. That's probably the biggest thing we've seen lately is over the last 3 or 4 years, inflation has really picked up and has decimated purchasing power. We didn't have inflation for a long time. And all of a sudden in 2021, post-COVID, inflation came in, I think it got as high as 9%. And everybody thought, oh, well, inflation's going to ratchet down and come down. The trouble is, it never comes down. The rate of growth of inflation comes down, but the amount that it already increased doesn't retract. Now it's just going up 2 or 3% a year on an already higher number. So it's kind of a misnomer to say prices are going to come down. They're just not going to go up as much as they were. Market volatility can undermine retirement security, especially early on, and we'll talk about that when we talk about sequence risk. Low interest rates have reduced the reliability of bonds and savings. It was only up until a few years ago that interest rates were, God, 0.5%, 1%. You would go to a bank and maybe you would get 0.75% on a CD. And, it's pretty hard to get retirement income when you're getting, 1% or less. Traditional pensions are disappearing, which shifts responsibility to individuals. Healthcare and long-term care costs are rising rapidly. In fact, a lot of insurance companies are no longer in the long-term care market because the actuaries underestimated long-term care costs and they got out of the market altogether. 3 ways retirees can generate income: Social Security and pensions. The pros, they're predictable and secure. The cons, Social Security is tricky to plan for effectively. The question is, when should you take it? How do you coordinate that between spouses? Second is annuities and lifetime income annuities. The pros, guaranteed income you can't outlive, but the cons, they're typically fixed payouts, and inflation will erode and decimate those fixed payouts over time. Imagine 5, 6 years ago, you could have locked in a lifetime income annuity when interest rates were extremely low and inflation was low, only to find out several years later, inflation kicked up and rates kicked up, and you put yourself in a corner. You really pinned yourself down. The third way is income producing assets. You can invest in bonds, stocks that pay dividends, covered call ETFs, exchange traded funds, oil and gas pipelines that pay out a pretty high distribution, real estate investment trusts, and CLOs, which are collateralized loan obligations that pay out 5, 6, 7% plus. The pros, they can generate cash flow without having to sell your assets. You could have growth potential of the income and the account value. The cons, though, they require specialized knowledge and they involve risk. There's volatility involved, and some people don't like that. Let's take a look at different retirement withdrawal strategies. The first one is the 4% rule. Many people have probably heard of the 4% rule. Now we have the income only approach, and then the third one is the dynamic spending approach. The description of each: the 4% rule. You take out 4% of your income of your portfolio initially, then you adjust it annually for inflation. You increase it for inflation every year. The income only approach, pretty self-explanatory. You only take out whatever interest and dividends or any other income source you have every month, set it out to your bank. The dynamic spending approach, you withdraw income based upon certain rules, based upon performance and sustainability. You might say, hey, my portfolio was up this year by 10%. I'm going to give myself a 10% distribution. That's a very crude way of looking at it. They get much more sophisticated than that. How do I uh, annually adjust my income according to each strategy? Well, the 4% rule, we always adjust for inflation. The income only, it will vary with the income. Generally, over time, dividends will increase, so you'll get a natural increase with the income only approach, but it varies. It's going to vary month to month and year to year. A dynamic spending approach, it's going to adjust if the guardrails allow. There could be years when the market's down and your portfolio's down where you might get a pay cut. I'm going to move this out of the way a little bit so I can see. There we go. And who is this best for, each strategy? Well, the 4% rule, it's very simple, right? It's very easy to implement. I just take out 4% every year and adjust it. For income only, it's great for very conservative investors that just want to take out income, who do not want to sell any principal, especially any principal at a loss. Dynamic spending, it's very good for it's a very adaptive, flexible approach for people that are flexible, retirees that want to take a more hands-on, more introspective look at their situation. But it entails a lot more work, a lot more knowledge and know-how than the other two approaches. How the strategies will respond to market changes. The 4% rule is very fixed, it's rigid, it keeps on paying even in downturns. And it, like we said, adjusts for inflation. The income only, it's consistent over market cycles. It's limited to income generated. But if the market goes up or down, doesn't matter. You're just going to spend and have the income that's generated sent out to your account. Dynamic spending, it adjusts intentionally, or intentionally adjusts with guardrails to protect your portfolio longevity. To make it a little bit more specific, dynamic spending doesn't just say the market goes up, you're going to give yourself a paycheck increase. The market goes down, we're going to cut it. It might say my portfolio yield has increased or decreased by X%. Now I'm going to give myself a pay increase or a pay decrease. So it can get really technical and really rule-based, which means, you know, it could last a lot longer. You can leave a bigger nest egg, but you have to stay on top of it year over year, and it gets a little bit tricky to implement. All right, let's take a look at the 4% rule. And this is a great graph that I got from JP Morgan. Basically what we have here, you start with $1 million in a 40-60 portfolio, 40% stocks and 60% bonds. Over 35 years, we're looking at a 35-year time horizon. Take out 4%. After 35 years, you'll have a little over 600,000 left. Now, this is, you know, really amazing to me. If you take out 5%, you do everything the same, except we're just taking out 1 more percent, you're going to run out of money in 27 years, roughly 27 years. Look what happens if you take out 6%. You're going to run through your money. You're going to burn through that $1 million in about 22 years. So very small changes in your distribution could lead to dramatically different results. So does that mean the 4% rule is the only rule to implement, the only one to use? No, but it does show there is some validity in that rule, and it's something to follow when it gives us a kind of a starting. Dynamic spending strategy highlights. So, you know, as we're going into this, you're going to see I'm kind of, you know, leaning towards a dynamic spending strategy because I think it's a little bit more higher end and it gives you more flexibility and probably will give you a better end result. It starts with a target. You know, for example, 4.5%. If inflation increases are allowed only if the portfolio health allows, Reductions or pauses may apply in down markets, allows for spending raises when the portfolio grows significantly. It might raise distributions by 5% if the portfolio rises by 5%, for example. If the portfolio value drops, it might freeze or even reduce the distribution. It's a balance between flexibility and sustainability. Recall the 4% rule always increases the payout regardless, uh, for inflation regardless. So no matter what happens with the 4% rule, you're always going to give yourself an increase for inflation. But with the dynamic rule, we might eventually on years, we might pay ourselves, 5.5, 6%, but we might have to reduce it depending upon down years. All right, here's another great slide. We're going to be talking about sequence risk. This means basically we can't control what's going to happen when we retire. The market can go up, it can go down when we initially start retiring, or it could stay flat. So we're going to look at two scenarios here. The first one, if you look at the first graph, the market was up about 20%, then it ended up down 20% in the last series of returns. The bottom graph just flips the returns. We started out down 20% and ended up 20%. And in the middle case, we just had an even 5% rate of return. So let's take a look at how each of these scenarios turned out. On the average return, we started with 500,000. And after 30 years, we had 630,000 left. Let's take a look at, we started great, ended bad, started with 500,000. We ended with 1.6 million. But look what happens when we started bad and ended good, when we just flipped it around. We burned through our money in about 22, 23 years. So to me, this is probably one of the best slides, and I've seen these before. They're phenomenal because it basically says, hey, when we retire, we can't control the market. The market's going to do what it's going to do. So it's almost the luck of the draw if we just randomly start pulling money from our accounts without any plan. If we have a good run, we could end up with over $1 million. If we have a bad market run when we start, we could run out of money, and it's just kind of like dumb luck. But there's ways to get around that. How do we mitigate the sequence risk of return? Well, we can build a cash reserve. We can hold 1 to 3 years of expenses in cash to avoid having to sell during down markets. We could use a bucket strategy where we can segment assets by time horizon. We have short-term, medium-term, and long-term buckets. We can apply the dynamic withdrawal rules, right? Adjust spending based upon portfolio performance. And these guys, Guyton and Klinger, were a couple of CFPs that designed a plan that was pretty sophisticated, very rules-based that, I'm not going to get into much detail about that right now. It's another webinar altogether, but they did extensive studies on showing how following their modeling and their dynamic spending could is far superior than just the standard 4% rule going forward. You could use partial annuities or guaranteed income, which would add stable income sources to reduce the pressure on your investment portfolio. But once again, the problem with that is that's going to be a fixed payout, and inflation can eat that up over time. You could have flexible spending plans where you're willing to cut or pause discretionary spending during market downturns. You might say, hey, I'm not going to buy a new car when the market's down 20%, which probably would make sense. And you could also diversify. If you use a well-diversified portfolio to smooth out volatility, then you might have some asset classes that go up when the market goes down, and you might be able to sell those instead of taking a hit. But go back to 2021 when the Fed raised interest rates and stocks and bonds both went down. There was really nowhere to run. So sometimes you're going to get pinched no matter what you do. All right, let's take a look at tax-efficient withdrawal strategies. How do we minimize taxes to extend portfolio life and avoid surprises? All right, let's talk. First, we're going to kind of tee this up by talking about different accounts and different rules. We have traditional 401ks and traditional IRAs. Those are pre-tax, right? We get a tax deduction, but they're taxed when we take the money out. A Roth IRA, on the other hand, on the flip side, we don't get a tax break, but they're tax free generally when we pull the money out. A Roth IRA, or sorry, Roth 401k, it's employer plan version of a Roth IRA. You don't get the tax break, but when you pull the money out, it's going to be tax free. Required minimum distributions apply to traditional 401ks and IRAs, but they do not apply to the Roth IRA distributions. Taxable accounts are going to be taxed annually. Excuse me 1 second. I'm going to take some water. If I pull money out of a taxable account, or if I leave it in a taxable account, the dividends and interests are going to be taxed regardless. Doesn't matter what I do, that money is going to be taxable. Withdrawal ages and penalties. Before age 59, there's a 10% penalty on qualified money. There are exceptions for medical and education, but generally speaking, there's a 10% hit if I pull money out before age 59. Between 59 and a half and 73, I have flexibility for strategic withdrawals. I can take the money out without a 10% penalty, but I have to pay tax on those qualified funds. 73 and beyond, though, I'm going to have to take my required minimum distributions, my RMDs, because the government wants to get paid. They want to tax those distributions. They want their money back. Roth IRAs, there are no RMDs during your lifetime. So that's why we're going to talk about doing some Roth conversions and why you want to have as much money in a Roth 401k or a Roth IRA, because then you don't have to pay tax on that money when you pull it out. Withdrawal from the right bucket. The common order of taking money out, kind of like the general, cookie cutter strategy might be, hey, take it from your taxable account first, then take it from your tax deferred money, then take it from your Roth money last. Or you can follow a balanced approach where you distribute income from all account types while doing Roth IRA conversions as well along the way. Using partial Roth conversions. All right, what are we talking about? How do you do a partial Roth conversion or any Roth conversion? If I've got an IRA or 401k, I could, get a Roth conversion form and transfer, let's say $10,000, $5,000, $100,000 if I want into a Roth IRA, and that would, to make it simple, get converted to ordinary income. I pay tax on that, and now I've got Roth IRA assets. But the idea is I want to fill up the lower taxed brackets first. So if I have room in my 12 or 22% tax bracket, I want to fill those up on an annual basis so I can convert those IRA assets into Roth IRA assets at very low marginal tax rates. So I can reduce future RMDs and taxes. I can protect against future tax increases, because if I can convert at 12% and all of a sudden taxes in the future are raised to 30%, now I've created a positive tax arbitrage. Right? I paid 12%. Now in the future, I'm not paying 30. That's obviously a good thing. I can accomplish this once again by converting my IRA or 401k to a Roth IRA. Top retirement income mistakes to avoid: withdrawing too much too soon, ignoring taxes and RMDs, failing to adjust for inflation. I see that a lot. It's real easy to look at financial plans and people don't put any inflation numbers in there or unrealistic inflation numbers. And, numbers look great until you put inflation numbers in, then they don't look so great. Not accounting for healthcare costs. I see that a lot. Overreacting to market volatility, neglecting to coordinate income sources. And here's the big one: not using realistic spending costs in retirement. I see this often where people come in and they give me numbers that are very, very low. I've seen people that have given me numbers saying that they spend $300 a month on food. Now, granted, that's for one person, but I don't know anybody who only spends $300 a month on food. It's a very low amount, and you have to use realistic numbers because, inflation is one thing, but if you're starting with a very low number, that's unrealistic. It's going to make these plans and these figures that you or I or anybody else sits down with look much better than they are going to be in reality. Smart ways to avoid these mistakes. Follow a sustainable withdrawal strategy. Once again, the dynamic spending rule or, cookie cutter approach, don't spend any more than 4%. Plan for an efficient withdrawal and do Roth conversions. Time when Social Security, when you should apply for Social Security and do that wisely to maximize your monthly income from Social Security. Budget for Medicare, long-term care, and supplemental insurance realistically. Use a diversified portfolio to avoid emotional decisions. Make sure you understand what you're invested in. So when you have those big 20, 30% market drawdowns, which are going to happen every 5 to 10 years, you feel comfortable in knowing what you own, so you're not going to be shaken out of the market. Rethinking the traditional withdrawal order. Typically, people will tell you take the taxable money out first because that's going to be the least expensive tax-wise. Allow the tax-deferred money to grow, which is the IRA, 401k, and then touch your Roth IRA money last. Well, the pros of that, it delays taxes on the IRA and the 401k, and preserves the Roth. But the cons, it could cause large RMDs later, could spike Medicare premiums, and it could increase Social Security taxation. Part of the other problem is, what I don't like about this, and I've never really followed that traditional order, is it doesn't give you any tax flexibility. Let's just say you don't have a Roth IRA, and then you spend on all your taxable money, and then you're left with a big IRA, and then what you've done is you've created yourself a tax trap. You have no tax flexibility. You've got just one big qualified account, and if they do really increase taxes in the future, now you're forced to take out money where you're taxed dollar for dollar at ordinary income rates that are going to be very high. I just never liked that approach. The balanced approach, you take mixed withdrawals and you do Roth conversions along the way. So you blend your withdrawals to fill low tax brackets early, use partial Roth conversions in your 60s before your required minimum distributions. You manage your Social Security taxation and IRMA thresholds, which doesn't trigger extra taxation on your Social Security, on your Medicare. And that the goal is to flatten taxes over retirement, avoid some of those tax traps in Medicare, and improve your portfolio longevity. Now, I'm not going to get into the balanced withdrawal approach, pros and cons. You guys are going to get a copy of this. I'll let you read this and study this. But we are going to go into an example that shows the pros and cons of this with an actual numerical example. We got a case study. Mary, for traditional versus balanced strategy. Mary retires at age 65. She's got 900,000 in an IRA, and she's got 300,000 in a Roth, 300,000 in a taxable account. She needs $90,000 a year after tax, but she has 36,000 in Social Security starting at age 67, which turns out to be her full retirement age, or where she's going to get 100% of her Social Security amount. The traditional order is going to say, I take the taxable, then the IRA, then the Roth. She's going to withdraw taxable money first, then the IRA. She's going to leave the Roth untouched. The IRA grows, but then she's going to have a big RMD at age 73. She's going to have higher taxes, and then that higher IRMA tax. That's kind of like that hidden tax trap. The Roth is preserved for her legacy, but unused in life. She's got kids, grandkids. In her legacy, she's going to have 1.2 million in an IRA that's going to be taxed at death. And her heirs are going to have to take that out over 10 years. So it used to be, before they changed the rules, that a beneficiary, a non-spousal beneficiary, could take it out over their remaining life expectancy. Now, got to take it out over 10 years. So she's inadvertently created a tax trap for her heirs. Now, if she followed a balanced plan where she took it out across all three accounts and did Roth conversions, now she's drawing it proportionally across all accounts. She's converting about 40 to 60,000 a year pre-RMD to her Roth. Now she's shrinking her RMD. She's flattening her tax brackets, and she's building up her Roth IRA. Now, in the legacy for her kids, grandkids, whoever, she's going to have more money to give and Roth IRA assets, which is going to lower the taxes to her heirs. And let's take a look at the numbers, how they look. Lifetime taxes paid. We're going to look at traditional on the left and balance on the right. Now, this is hypothetical. Nothing is set in stone. This is going to assume a high marginal tax bracket for everybody. But the traditional strategy, lifetime taxes paid for married, 420 versus 350. Medicare IRMA risk is going to be higher after 73 because she's going to have a higher RMD to pull out because her IRA is going to be higher and her RMDs are going to be higher. It's going to be lower under the balance strategy because her RMDs aren't going to be as big. And that ties in with our next column here, our next row rather. RMD size is going to be large after 73. It's going to be smaller in the balance strategy. Her taxable estate at death, she's got about 1.2 million in the IRA, about 800,000 in the Roth. But in the balance strategy, because we did Roth conversions, she's got 500,000 in the IRA and 1.5 million in the Roth. The tax burden to her heirs, about 400,000 under the traditional, because they're going to have to pay in that big IRA, and it's about 150 to 200,000 under the balance strategy because the majority of her estate is going to be in tax-free Roth IRA assets. So once again, the tax-free legacy is going to be lower under the traditional and much higher under the balance strategy. So that wraps it up. Creating an income plan is essentially a two-step process. You calculate your cash flow requirement. You invest your assets and deposit funds monthly to your bank account. You always hear numbers and people say, well, you need at least $2 million in retirement in today's market, or 3 million, or 1.5 million. Well, basically, it's really a function of how much cash flow you need. And that's really a function of how much do you need versus how much guaranteed sources do you have. So if I need 100,000 of income after tax, and that all depends upon how much debt I have. But if I've got 90,000 coming in from Social Security and a pension, well, I only need $10,000 worth of income, and maybe I only need a few 100,000 of assets. But if I have 20,000 coming in Social Security, and if I need 120,000 a year to enjoy my retirement, I'm going to need 2-3 million bucks in my retirement, especially if I want to leave a large estate to my heirs. So everything that we're talking about here, it's a function of my debt, my guaranteed recurring income, and pensions and Social Security, in how much income can I generate. So it's an interactive process. So thanks for joining us once again, and stay tuned for our upcoming webinars. You'll be contacted. We're going to have a whole series coming up, and I appreciate you taking your time. Thank you.